My name is Elias Crowe, and when I accepted the role of lighthouse keeper, I expected isolation, not madness. But the sea outside never stopped whispering my name, and sometimes, I swear I heard my own voice answering back. The first time I saw the lighthouse up close, I thought it was a skeleton of stone standing against the endless sea. Its white paint had peeled away long ago, leaving behind a mottled surface like weathered bone. The gulls circled overhead, screaming in the wind, but the place itself seemed too quiet. I had come here to be alone, to take on the solitary duty of keeping the light burning for ships that might pass through this part of the coast. I told myself it would be peaceful, a break from the world, but even as I stepped inside I felt the silence tighten around me like a rope. The door groaned when it shut, and the air inside was damp, heavy with the smell of salt and rust. The spiral staircase rose upward into darkness, the steps iron and slick, as if coated with invisible condensation. Every time I touched the railing, it left a tacky film on my hands that clung stubbornly no matter how often I wiped it away. I tried to shake it off as age, as neglect, but something about it felt too fresh, like a secretion rather than simple moisture. I explored my quarters first, a small room with a narrow bed, a desk, and a single cracked mirror nailed to the wall. The sheets smelled faintly of mildew, though they had been freshly prepared according to the papers I signed before coming here. There were no personal touches, no remnants of the previous keeper. It was as if whoever lived here before me had been erased completely. The only sound was the ocean outside, steady and endless, crashing against the unseen rocks below. When night fell, I climbed the staircase and lit the lantern. The flame came alive with a hungry glow, magnified by the thick glass lens, until it cut across the water in great arcs of pale fire. As it rotated, the sea appeared and vanished, revealed only in slices of illumination. Watching it for too long made me dizzy, so I turned away, but the sound of the machinery hummed through the tower like a heartbeat, constant and alive. I told myself the first night would be the hardest. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up, listening to the rhythm of waves. But just as I began to drift off, I noticed something strange. The ocean sounded too close. It wasn't the distant roar I had heard during the day, it was sharper, heavier, as though the waves were breaking right against the walls of the lighthouse. I sat up, heart pounding, straining my ears. It almost sounded like water slapping directly against stone, just beneath the window. I reminded myself the lighthouse was perched on rocks. The tide must have risen higher, nothing unusual. Still, unease gnawed at me. At some point, I managed to close my eyes again, only to wake in a panic with the taste of salt burning my mouth. My throat felt raw, as if I had swallowed seawater in my sleep. I threw off the blankets and froze. The sheets beneath me were damp, clinging to my skin. I pressed my hand against the mattress, and my fingers came away wet, shining under the moonlight filtering through the window. The air was heavy, suffocating, filled with the unmistakable stench of brine and rot. I scrambled out of bed, bare feet hitting the floor with a splash. There were puddles on the wooden boards, spreading outward in thin rivulets. My mind fought to explain it. Away, maybe the roof leaked, maybe a pipe had burst. But when I followed the trail of water, it led not to the ceiling or the walls, but to the base of my bed. I stood there in silence, trembling, staring at the wet floor. My pulse thundered in my ears. I crouched down slowly, forcing myself to look beneath the bed frame, half expecting to see waves crashing there. But it was empty, only shadows. I let out a shaky breath, but the smell was stronger now, almost unbearable. When I rose again, my eyes caught something in the pale glow of the window. At the foot of the bed, in the largest puddle, the water seemed darker, almost black. I leaned closer and realized it wasn't just seawater, it was thick, sluggish, like something mixed into it. For a moment, I thought I saw it ripple, though the air was still and no breeze reached inside. The silence of the room pressed in on me, broken only by the distant machinery of the lantern above, groaning as it turned. I forced myself back onto the bed, too exhausted to stay awake, but too afraid to close my eyes. My body shivered against the damp sheets, my skin itching where it touched the moisture. I told myself morning would explain everything. Morning always explained things. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I could not shake the feeling that the sea had already found a way inside, that I was no longer keeping the ocean out. Instead, it was slowly, patiently, dragging itself closer to me. And as I finally surrendered to a restless half-sleep, I swore I felt the faint trickle of cold water against my ankle, as though something wet had reached out from beneath the bed to touch me. I woke with the weak light of dawn pressing through the window, though it did little to comfort me. The sheets were dry again, as though nothing strange had happened, yet the smell of brine still lingered in the room. My throat burned, rough and irritated, and when I coughed, I swore I tasted salt at the back of my tongue. I tried to laugh it off in my mind, telling myself it must have been a dream, the kind of vivid nightmare of loneliness and isolation could conjure. But when I lowered my feet to the floor, I found faint outlines where puddles had been, pale rings staining the wood. It had been real. Something had happened in the night. I forced myself to begin my morning routine. I cleaned the room first, scrubbing at the boards until the faint marks faded, but no matter how hard I worked, I could not rid myself of the smell. The scent of rot clung to me, my skin, my clothes. When I stepped outside onto the balcony to breathe fresh air, the sea wind slammed into me with a sharp chill, and I froze. Where the shoreline should have been jagged rocks, dark cliffs, and narrow stretches of beach, there was only water. It stretched endlessly in all directions, the horizon unbroken by land. I rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing wrong. The shore had been there when I arrived. I had walked it myself, yet now there was nothing, just a flat, gray expanse of water that seemed to lean toward me, as though it were alive. A cold tremor ran down my back. I could not explain it. Perhaps fog, I thought, or some trick of perspective. Perhaps the tide was unusually high, though even then it made no sense for the land to simply vanish. I stayed outside too long, staring at the horizon until my head began to ache from the glare of the light. When I returned inside, the lighthouse no longer felt the same. The spiral staircase groaned with each step I took, not from my weight but as though the tower itself resented my presence. I tried to dismiss it, but the sound was different, no sharper, wetter, like something slithering between the cracks. Later, as I performed my duties, polishing the lens and trimming the wick, I pressed my ear against the inner wall, following a faint sound I thought I heard. It was not the groaning of the stone or the rumble of the sea outside. It was softer, persistent, like water dripping endlessly in a cavern. When I pressed harder, my skin chilled. I realized the sound was not random. It had a pattern, almost like speech. Words murmured in a rhythm, low and bubbling, as though someone were whispering through a mouthful of seawater. I pulled away quickly, heart hammering. But once I had heard it, I could not unhear it. The whispers followed me down the stairs, faint and steady, like a second pulse within the walls. No matter where I stood, they seemed to seep closer. I began to wonder if the stone itself was hollow, filled with water carrying voices from somewhere deep below. That night, I tried not to look at the water, but the pull was too strong. I stood by the window as the lantern beam circled, slicing across the waves. At first I saw only the restless surface, the endless tide shifting in the dark. Then something appeared in the light. A pale shape floated just beyond the reach of the waves. At first, I thought it was driftwood, but as the beam swung back, I saw it clearly. A face. It was colorless, smooth, staring upward without expression. The eyes were wide, dark holes, and its mouth hung slack as though gasping for air. My body locked in terror. I could not move, could not breathe. I waited for the light to swing again, desperate to prove myself wrong. But when it returned, the face was gone. The ocean was empty once more. I stumbled back from the window, heart racing so hard I felt dizzy. I told myself I had imagined it, the way shapes form in the clouds or shadows, but deep down, I knew what I had seen. I knew the eyes had been staring not at the lighthouse, but at me. I tried to rest, curling beneath my damp-smelling sheets, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale face rising through the water, waiting for the light to sweep over it again. And when I finally drifted into uneasy sleep, I dreamt of dozens of them, floating silently in the waves, their hollow eyes fixed upward, waiting for something they already knew would come. I barely slept, and when I did, my dreams were heavy with water. I woke feeling as though I had been drowning all night, my chest tight, my skin clammy. The air inside the lighthouse was colder than before, the stone walls damp to the touch. My breath fogged the glass of the small window, though it was not winter. I rubbed at my arms and froze when I noticed how pale they looked. The skin seemed drained of color, faint gray blotches spreading like bruises beneath the surface. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, the result of too many sleepless nights, but a part of me knew something was changing. I forced myself into routine. I trimmed the wick, polished the glass, climbed the stairs, descended again. I tried to ignore the whispers that now filled every corner of the lighthouse, but they were no longer faint. They rose and fell like a tide, a chorus of voices murmuring through the walls. They were not human voices. They gurgled, hissed, and cracked, as though spoken from throats filled with water. At times they almost seemed to be calling my name. I began to lose track of hours. The light above circled endlessly, but the sky outside remained gray and heavy, neither day nor night. I could not remember when I had last seen the sun. The sea looked wrong now. Its surface rippled unnaturally, to still one moment, to violent the next. I would stand at the balcony staring down, and feel the unmistakable sense of being watched. It was during one of these moments, leaning over the railing, that I noticed something moving below. At first, it was only shadows beneath the waves, long and sinuous, twisting in ways no fish could. Then the lantern beam swung across them, and I saw faces, dozens of them, pale and bloated, drifting just below the surface. They were not sinking, not floating away. They were holding themselves still, all turned upward, eyes open, mouths slack, staring silently at me. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles went white. The longer I looked, the more faces I saw. Some looked fresh, their features clear. Others were warped, skin stretched thin, peeling, slipping from the bone beneath. Their eyes glistened like glass marbles. I staggered back, choking on my own breath. When the lantern's light swung back again, the faces were gone as though the water had swallowed them whole. but the smell of rot clung to the air, carried upward from the ocean itself. I tried to flee back inside, but the spiral staircase offered no comfort. As I climbed, the shadows between the steps seemed deeper, darker. Shapes flickered there, shifting just as I turned my head, vanishing before I could focus. That night, I lay in bed listening to the waves. The whispers did not stop. They had followed me inside, surrounding me, filling my ears with their endless chorus. I pressed the pillow over my head, but it made no difference. The voices slid into my skull, wrapping themselves around my thoughts, drowning them. They spoke of the deep, of the weight of the sea, of surrender. I told myself not to listen, not to understand, but the longer I lay there, the clearer their words became. At some point, I dragged myself to the cracked mirror on the wall. I needed to see myself, to anchor myself in reality. But what stared back at me was not the same. My face was thinner, the skin pale, my eyes dark and sunken. I leaned closer, horrified to see tiny veins spreading across the whites of my eyes like spiderwebs, tinged faintly with gray. My lips were chapped, but when I licked them, they tasted of salt. I stumbled back, heart racing. I told myself it was isolation, the mind breaking under pressure. Yet when I turned, I felt movement above me, a faint scraping on the staircase. I froze, listening. It was not the groan of old iron or stone. It was wet, slithering, something dragging itself across the steps. I climbed slowly, every muscle in my body tense. The sound grew louder as I approached the lantern room. My pulse hammered in my ears, drowning out everything but the slick, crawling noise ahead. When I pushed open the heavy door, the room was empty. Only the sea stretched out below, vast and endless, the lantern beam cutting across it. I leaned against the railing, trying to catch my breath. But then the light swept over the water and my stomach turned. The faces were back, not drifting this time but rising, hundreds of them, their pale features breaking the surface, and they were closer than before, packed tightly together, staring up with lifeless eyes. As the light circled again, I saw what I hadn't before. They weren't faces at all. They were masks in sheets of skin, stretched and floating like offerings, and beneath them, something darker moved, massive and slow, waiting for me to notice. I stopped keeping track of days. Time no longer felt real inside the lighthouse. The lantern turned endlessly above me, its beam cutting across the black water in a rhythm that had begun to feel like the pulse of something alive. I slept little, ate even less. The food I had brought tasted spoiled, metallic and sour, as though the sea had seeped into it. Even the water in the tap carried a faint briny tang. Each sip left my tongue dry, my throat raw, as if I was swallowing the ocean itself. My body betrayed me further. The gray blotches that first appeared on my arms had spread across my chest and neck. My skin had grown thinner, damp to the touch, as though it were no longer mine. Every morning when I looked into the cracked mirror, I saw less of myself. My cheeks had hollowed, my eyes sunk into their sockets, but worse than that was the color pale, clammy, tinged with a shade that reminded me of fish left too long in the sun. Sometimes, when I leaned too close, I swore the reflection rippled like water. The lighthouse groaned at night. Its walls trembled as though struck by waves, though the sea below looked calm. The whispers that once slipped through the stone now roared in my head. They no longer sounded far away, they were inside, pressing against my skull, twisting themselves into words I could understand. They spoke of the deep, of hunger, of belonging. They told me that resistance was pointless, that every keeper before me had learned to let go, that I was already theirs. I tried to ignore them, but the signs grew stronger. My clothes smelled of rot no matter how often I changed. My footsteps left damp prints behind me, though the floor was dry. The lantern's flame flickered in strange rhythms, as though responding to some unseen presence. The machinery, once steady, now thudded like a heartbeat, slower, heavier, almost organic. I told myself it was all in my head, but doubt had begun to gnaw away at reason. One night I was dragged from restless sleep by a sound unlike the others, not the hum of voices or the groaning of walls, but footsteps, slow, wet, dragging footsteps, echoing through the spiral staircase. My blood turned cold, the air grew heavy, saturated with the smell of seawater and decay. I sat upright, heart racing, straining to see through the dim light. Something was in the room with me. At first, it was only a shape in the corner, a darker shadow among shadows. Then it shifted and I saw its form, tall, thin, its body pale and bloated, mottled with gray patches like my own. Its skin looked waterlogged, swollen as though it had been submerged for days. The head tilted unnaturally to the side, hanging loose, as if the bones within had softened. Each step it took made the floorboards creak under the weight of its sodden body. I could not move. Terror locked every muscle in place as the figure came closer, the wet sound of its steps filling the room. My breath caught in my throat, shallow and sharp. The figure stopped at the edge of my bed. For a long moment it did not move, only leaned forward slightly, its head twisting farther than it should have been able to. The lantern above flickered once, twice, then went out. Darkness swallowed everything. I lay frozen in the pitch black, hearing nothing but the ragged beat of my heart and the steady drip of water on the floorboards. I do not know how long I stayed like that, seconds or hours, but when the lantern finally sputtered back to life, the room was empty, the shadow was gone. But the sheets beneath me were soaked, clinging to my skin like seaweed. A line of wet footprints led away from the bed, across the floor, and toward the staircase. They stopped halfway up, vanishing into the shadows above, as if the figure had melted back into the walls of the tower. I sat there shivering until morning, though morning meant nothing anymore. The lighthouse had become a prison of stone and salt, and something else lived here with me now, something that had once been a man. Perhaps a keeper like me, perhaps a glimpse of what I was becoming. I could not tell how long I had been inside the lighthouse anymore. Time had collapsed into a loop of darkness, salt, and whispers. The lantern above still turned, sweeping across the water, but it no longer marked the hours. The sun had vanished days ago, or perhaps weeks. I had lost any sense of rising and setting. All that remained was the endless gray sky, the endless black water, and the endless voices calling to me from below. My body was no longer mine. The gray stains had spread fully across my arms, my chest, even my face. My skin was clammy, always damp, and it gave off the faint scent of rot no matter how often I tried to clean it. My reflection in the cracked mirror had grown unrecognizable. The eyes that stared back were sunken, ringed in black, glistening faintly like the surface of wet stones. My lips were cracked, bleeding, but when I licked them, they tasted of brine, as though seawater was inside me now, flowing where blood should be. The whispers had grown louder than thought. They spoke in unison, hundreds of voices rising and falling like the tide. They no longer felt like they were coming from the walls. They came from inside me, curling around my mind, dragging my thoughts into their rhythm. They told me truths I did not want to hear. They told me that the lighthouse was never meant to guide ships. It was a beacon, yes, but not for men. It was a signal for the deep, a call for what lay beneath the ocean's surface. The light was not a warning, it was an invitation. And the sea had answered. I thought of the faces I had seen floating in the waves. I thought of the figure that stood in my room, dripping, pale, broken. They had been keepers once. All of them men who came here believing they were alone, only to be consumed slowly, reshaped until they belonged to the sea. The truth pressed down on me like the weight of the ocean itself. I was next. I was already changing. One night, or what I thought was night, I climbed the spiral staircase to the lantern room. The air grew colder the higher I went. My bare feet left wet prints on the iron steps, though I had not touched water. The machinery thudded like a slow, monstrous heart, echoing through the tower. When I reached the top, I stepped out onto the balcony. The sea was waiting. The lantern's beam swung across the horizon, but there was no horizon anymore, only water stretching into infinity. The ocean was packed with faces now. Not a few, not dozens, but hundreds, pale, bloated, staring upward without blinking. Their mouths hung open in silence, and as the light touched them, their features shifted. Some I recognized. I saw the drowned figure from my room. I saw men I had never met, but felt I somehow knew. And then, in the mass of faces, I saw my own face, pale and slack, already floating among them. Its eyes were glassy, its lips blue, its expression lifeless. It stared straight up at me as though it had been waiting. My stomach twisted, but my body did not move away from the railing. Instead, I leaned closer, drawn forward by something I could not resist. The whispers filled my head, louder now, commanding, promising. They told me the truth of what I already was. I had died the moment I stepped inside this place. What remained was only a husk, slowly drawn into their world. The wind howled across the balcony, carrying the stench of rot. My skin prickled, burning with cold, and I knew I could not hold myself back much longer. I felt the pull, deep and irresistible, dragging me toward the edge. The ocean below seemed to reach upward, its surface trembling as if eager to claim me. My hands tightened on the railing, but my fingers were slick, my grip weak, and then I heard it. My own voice. It came not from my throat, but from below, rising with the tide of whispers. It spoke my name, soft and broken, repeated again and again until it drowned out everything else. I looked down and saw the face that matched mine open its mouth. The voice spilled from it, familiar and wrong at the same time, echoing through the salt air. I closed my eyes, but the sound did not stop. It was inside me now, wrapping around my thoughts, pulling me downward. I felt my body sway forward, felt the railing cold against my chest. When I opened my eyes, the lantern light swung across the water one last time, and in its beam I saw something vast moving beneath the surface. Not a face, not a body, but something greater in outline, so massive it made the sea itself tremble. The pale masks floated above it like offerings, waiting. The last thing I remember is letting go. I do not know if I fell, or if something rose up to take me, but the whispers stopped the moment the cold closed over me, and all I heard was silence. A silence too deep, too endless, to ever escape.